He hit .420 in a single season and still isn't remembered as baseball's greatest hitter. He's remembered as its scariest villain. For almost 60 years, people have repeated the same story about him. A violent, spike-sharpening racist who once strangled a man to death in a back alley and never showed a shred of remorse. Sportswriters wrote it, a movie starring Tommy Lee Jones dramatized it, a famous documentary repeated it as fact. There's just one problem. Almost none of it happened the way you were told. The man who built that reputation never even met Ty Cobb until Cobb was dying. He collected a paycheck, took Cobb's private letters and photographs, and after Cobb was in the ground, he sat down and invented a monster. Decades later, an FBI investigation would prove that man had been forging Cobb's own handwriting the entire time. This is the real story of Ty Cobb. The batting records are real. The temper was real. The fortune he built off the field was so enormous, most fans have never heard a word about it. And the darkest chapter of his legend, the one everyone still believes, was manufactured by a stranger after Cobb couldn't defend himself anymore. Number 1. The night everything changed, before his career even started. Tyrus Raymond Cobb was born on December 18, 1986 in Narrows, Georgia, to a father who was about as far from a baseball man as you could get. William Herschel Cobb was a school teacher, a college-educated state senator, and a man being talked about as a future governor of Georgia. He wanted his son to become a doctor, a lawyer, anything respectable. Baseball to him was a waste of a good mind. He allegedly told his son not to come home a failure. Ty went anyway, chasing a spot with the Augusta Taurists in the minor leagues, desperate to prove his father wrong. He never really got the chance. On the night of August 8, 1905, William Cobb told his wife Amanda he was leaving town for a few days. He didn't. Suspicious that she was seeing someone else, he doubled back that same night, climbed toward the upstairs window of their own home and tried to get a look inside. Amanda, hearing someone outside in the dark, grabbed the shotgun her husband had given her for protection and fired. Then she fired again. When the smoke cleared, the father who told his son to make something of himself was dead on his own porch, and the son was 18 years old, 5 hours away, with no idea any of it had happened. He found out by telegram. It didn't explain much, just that his father was dead in a shooting accident. By the time Ty made it home, the truth was already spreading through the small town of Royston. His own mother had pulled the trigger. She was charged with manslaughter, tried the following spring, and acquitted, insisting to the end that she'd mistaken her husband for an intruder. The full story, whether it was really an accident or something far darker, was never settled. Ty rarely spoke of it publicly for the rest of his life. Weeks after burying his father, Ty was in a Detroit Tigers uniform. He was 18, grieving, from a small Georgia farm town, dropped into a big league clubhouse full of grown men who resented him for it. He would later say he never got over what happened that night. Whatever else people would eventually accuse him of, the man who showed up in Detroit that August was carrying something most rookies never have to carry at all. But that grief didn't slow him down. If anything, it lit a fuse. Number 2, the most dominant hitter anyone had ever seen. But before that, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on future videos like this one, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this. Cobb's rookie welcome in Detroit was brutal. Veteran teammates hazed him mercilessly. Some allegedly went out of their way to sabotage him, and by his own account, he had a nervous breakdown before his second season even started. He came out of it a different player, not friendlier, better. What followed over the next 2 decades is still, by some measures, the greatest offensive run in the sport's history. Cobb won 12 batting titles. He hit over 400 in 3 separate seasons. He batted at least .300 for 23 consecutive years, a streak nobody has come close to touching. When he finally retired, he held the all-time records for hits, runs scored, and stolen bases, marks that stood for roughly half a century before anyone caught them. His career batting average, .366, stood as the highest in modern Major League history for nearly 100 years, only recently overtaken when statistics from the Negro Leagues were folded into the official book's records. He didn't just hit for average either. He was a Triple Crown winner, an MVP, and a base-stealing menace who once stole second, third, and home in the same inning, something he managed 4 separate times in his career. In 1936, when the Baseball Hall of Fame held its very first vote, Cobb received more votes than Babe Ruth, more than anyone. It stayed the record for player support for over 50 years. Look closer at just one of those seasons and the numbers get almost absurd. In 1911, Cobb hit .420, the highest single-season average of his career, while also leading the American League in hits, runs, RBIs, stolen bases, doubles, triples, and slugging percentage. He struck out swinging exactly twice that entire year, not twice a month, twice in a full season of Major League pitching. He was voted MVP almost unanimously. The only category he didn't lead the league in that year was home runs, and even there, he still finished second. He wasn't just piling up numbers for himself either. As Detroit's player manager starting in 1921, Cobb took a young hitter named Harry Heilmann under his wing and helped turn him into one of the most feared bats of the decade. Watching Heilmann's average jump 85 points in a single season on his way to a batting title. Around the same time, Cobb was one of the first people in the organization to recognize the talent in a young infielder named Charlie Gehringer, who would go on to a Hall of Fame career of his own. The same man building a reputation as baseball's most selfish, most hated competitor was quietly shaping the careers of future legends behind the scenes. He earned every ounce of the fear opposing teams had for him. What he didn't earn was everything that came next. Number 3. The one dark story about him that's actually true. Before we get into the myths, here's the part of the legend that holds up, because Cobb wasn't a saint, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest either. On May 15, 1912, during a game in New York, a fan in the stands named Claude Luker had spent the afternoon hurling insults at Cobb from his seat. Cobb ignored it for a while. Then he didn't. He walked into the stands, went after Luker and beat him, later admitting he kept going even after realizing the man had lost most of both hands in a workplace accident years earlier and could barely defend himself. When bystanders shouted for Cobb to stop because the man had no hands, Cobb reportedly answered that he didn't care if the man had no feet either. Baseball's league office suspended him indefinitely. What happened next is the part almost nobody remembers. His own Tigers teammates, the same men who had hazed him mercilessly as a rookie, walked out in protest of the suspension, refusing to play until Cobb was reinstated. Detroit had to field a team of amateurs pulled off the street just to avoid forfeiting a game. Cobb was eventually fined and reinstated after 10 days. It's the one incident in his legend that isn't exaggeration or invention. It happened exactly the way it sounds, and it's ugly. There's a second real controversy worth mentioning too, one that had nothing to do with his temper and everything to do with his integrity as a player. Late in his career, a former teammate named Dutch Leonard accused Cobb, along with fellow legends Tris Speaker and Smokey Joe Wood, of conspiring to fix the outcome of a 1919 game between Detroit and Cleveland. It was one of the most serious accusations a ballplayer could face in the era right after the Black Sox betting scandal nearly destroyed the sport's credibility. Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis investigated personally and ultimately cleared all three men, though the accusation trailed Cobb for the rest of his life, and plenty of contemporaries privately wondered if Landis simply didn't want another gambling scandal on his hands so soon after the last one. But it's the fistfight and the gambling accusation that were, at minimum, grounded in real, documented events. Almost everything else people believe about Ty Cobb traces back to one man, and that man never even watched Cobb play in his prime. Number 4. The ghostwriter who built a monster. His name was Al Stump. In 1960, with Cobb dying of cancer and desperate for money, he agreed to let Stump help ghostwrite his autobiography. Stump spent months around the dying, medicated, isolated old man, and by his own later admission, that first book was sanitized, a cover-up of the real Cobb, in his words. Cobb died in July 1961. Stump waited only months before publishing a very different version of events. A sensational magazine article claimed Cobb had confessed to killing a man in a back alley and getting away with it. Decades later, a full-life biography painted him as a psychopath, a spike-sharpening, gun-toting, racist tyrant hated by nearly everyone in baseball. That book became the basis for a 1994 film starring Tommy Lee Jones, and its version of Cobb has been repeated in documentaries and article after article ever since, treated less like one writer's account and more like settled history. Here's the part that unraveled everything. In the 1990s and 2000s, researchers started digging into Stump's claims and found holes everywhere. A forensic specialist and former prosecutor combed through actual Detroit autopsy records and period newspapers, looking for any trace of the alleyway Stump swore Cobb confessed to. He found nothing. No body, no missing person, no news coverage, nothing that should exist if the story were true. Then it got worse for Stump's credibility. Investigators discovered he had spent years forging Cobb memorabilia after Cobb's death. Fake letters, fake autographs, even fabricated diary pages written in Cobb's handwriting in green ink, sold into the collector's market as authentic. One of those forged diaries ended up on display inside the actual Baseball Hall of Fame museum before an FBI investigation confirmed it was fake. If a man was willing to forge his subject's own handwriting for profit, how much of his reporting on that same subject should anyone trust? That's the question that changed everything about how historians look at Ty Cobb. It's worth sitting with how much cultural weight one discredited writer's version of a man managed to carry. Stump's article and biography weren't just read, they were absorbed into the historical record almost unquestioned. A widely praised Emmy-winning documentary about the history of baseball repeated the same characterization, calling Cobb an embarrassment to the sport because of his supposed racism, treating a magazine writer's uncorroborated claims as though they were settled fact. A major Hollywood film dramatized the invented back alley killing as though it had court records behind it. For roughly 3 decades, an entire generation of fans, and in some cases, entire baseball encyclopedias, absorbed the portrait of Cobb built almost entirely on the word of a man who forged handwriting for a living. It took forensic document examiners, a criminal law-trained researcher combing through a century-old paper trail, and an FBI forgery investigation to start pulling that portrait apart. Number 5. The myths that didn't survive being checked. Once people started actually checking Stump's version of Cobb against the historical record, one story after another fell apart. The spikes. For generations, fans have repeated that Cobb deliberately sharpened his metal cleats before games, specifically to injure opposing infielders on his slides. It's one of the most famous images attached to his name. There's no contemporary evidence that it ever happened that way. Cobb played in an aggressive, hard sliding. That part is true. But the image of him crouched in the dugout filing his spikes into weapons appears to be exactly what it sounds like, a story that got more dramatic with every retelling. The racism. This is the accusation that's followed Cobb the hardest, the one that turned him, in later pop culture, into a symbol of everything backward about the era he played in. And it's arguably the one that's been the most thoroughly undermined by actual documentation. Researchers digging through newspaper archives found Cobb, decades after retiring, publicly and repeatedly praising baseball's integration. In 1952, asked directly about a black player joining a Texas League club, Cobb told a reporter that integration was long overdue and that black players deserved to be, in his words, accepted wholeheartedly. He praised Jackie Robinson by name. He said Willie Mays was the only player of that era he'd pay money to watch. None of that erases the ugliness of the world Cobb came from, a deep south of the early 1900s that was steeped in racism at every level of society, and Cobb was absolutely a product of that world in his younger years. But the specific, cartoonish villain version of Cobb, the one built almost entirely on Stump's unverifiable claims about slurs and violence, doesn't hold up against the man's own recorded words later in life. Even the idea that Cobb died alone and unmourned, hated by the entire sport, gets complicated by the historical record. His funeral drew former players and old friends. Family scrapbooks his own wife kept for decades, later donated to the Hall of Fame by his granddaughter, show a man who stayed connected to relatives and took pride in his family, not the friendless recluse of the popular myth. None of this means Ty Cobb was easy to like. Nearly every account, friendly or hostile, agrees he was intense, combative, and difficult. But there's a wide gap between difficult, intensely competitive ballplayer from a hard era and sociopathic killer who sharpens his spikes to maim children in the stands. And that gap is almost entirely Al Stump's creation. And here's the part that makes the myth even stranger. While the public was busy believing Cobb died broke, bitter, and alone, the truth was almost the exact opposite. Number 6. The secret fortune nobody talks about. Ty Cobb quietly became one of the richest athletes in American history, and he did it decades before agents, endorsement deals, or free agency turned pro sports into big business. He did it by reading a stock ticker. In 1907, using cotton futures winnings he'd earned during World War I demand spikes, Cobb bought 300 shares in a small, unproven Georgia beverage company, Coca-Cola. He kept buying. By the time he died, that original stake had grown into roughly 24,000 shares, and he'd used the profits to purchase multiple Coca-Cola bottling plants outright. That wasn't his only move. Cobb took a $25,000 endorsement payment and put it into United Motors stock. When General Motors acquired that company, his shares converted directly into GM stock, and he held onto it for decades. During the Great Depression, while most people were losing everything, Cobb went the other direction, buying up deeply discounted land around Lake Tahoe while prices were on the floor. By the time he died in 1961, Cobb's estate was worth somewhere between $11 and $32 million, depending on how you count his real estate, translating to well over $100 million in today's money by conservative estimates, and by some calculations, hundreds of millions more. His portfolio was reportedly generating close to $500,000 a year in dividends alone late in his life. He left a quarter of it to a college scholarship fund for Georgia students that, decades later, is still handing out millions in tuition money every single year. The most feared man in baseball spent his retirement quietly outperforming most of Wall Street. One calculation, factoring in decades of Coca-Cola stock splits and reinvested dividends, suggested that if Cobb's original stake had simply been left untouched in a trust, it could theoretically have grown into a fortune worth billions in modern terms. He didn't need the batting titles to be remembered as one of the wealthiest men to ever put on a uniform. He just needed a broker. Number 7. The family most fans never hear about. Off the field, Cobb's personal life was as complicated as everything else attached to his name. He married Charlotte Charlie Lombard in 1908, and the two had 5 children together: Tyrus Jr., Shirley, Herschel, Howell, and Beverly. It was not a peaceful marriage. Charlie filed for divorce more than once over the years before it was finally dissolved, and friends described a household strained by Cobb's long absences, his temper, and the sheer intensity he carried home from the ballpark. He remarried later in life to a woman named Frances Cass, and that marriage also ended in divorce. His relationships with his own children were, by most accounts, distant and difficult, echoing in some ways the same coldness Cobb had grown up navigating with his own father. 2 of his sons died before he did, and Cobb reportedly struggled to reconcile with surviving family members in his final years, spending long stretches of his retirement alone at his properties, hunting, fishing, and trading stocks. It's one of the few parts of the myth that historians generally agree has some truth to it. Whatever Cobb built in his career and his portfolio, he never quite figured out how to build peace at home. And yet, even that story has been softened by more recent digging. Family scrapbooks kept by his first wife for decades, eventually donated to the Hall of Fame by one of his granddaughters, reportedly show a man who stayed engaged with family milestones and took real pride in being a father and grandfather, not the isolated, friendless figure later writers preferred. Number 8. How the legend actually ended. Ty Cobb died of prostate cancer on July 17, 1961, at 74 years old in Atlanta. In his final years, he was sick, medicated, and increasingly isolated by illness. Exactly the vulnerable state Al Stump found him in when he came calling with a tape recorder and a book deal. Cobb wanted his story told before it was too late. Instead, he handed the pen to a man who would spend the next 3 decades rewriting who he was. He's buried in Rose Hill Cemetery in Royston, Georgia, not far from the father whose death changed the course of his entire life before his career had even properly begun. The Hall of Fame plaque still calls him one of the greatest players the game has ever produced. It doesn't mention the forged diaries, the fabricated killing, or the decades it took researchers to start pulling the myth apart. Number 9. What the real story actually tells us. Strip away Al Stump's fiction, and you're left with something more complicated than a monster, and honestly more interesting. A grieving 18-year-old who lost his father in a shooting inside his own family, thrown into a big league clubhouse weeks later with no time to process any of it. A player so relentless he set records that survived nearly 100 years. A man capable of real, documented cruelty. The attack on Claude Luker isn't a myth, it happened. And also a man whose actual public record on race, in his own words, decades later, directly contradicts the caricature built around his name. Somewhere between the records and the rage was a person, not the cartoon villain a struggling ghostwriter needed to sell magazines and forge autographs after that person could no longer speak for himself. If this story surprised you, that's exactly the point. If this is the first time you're hearing the real version of Ty Cobb, drop a comment with which part shocked you most: the father's death, the forged diaries, or the secret Coca-Cola fortune. And subscribe, because the next name we're taking apart has a legend just as twisted and a truth even harder to believe.